Under the dense night sky of the New World centuries ago, there was a sound that never ceased echoing. It was not the sound of a leather whip tearing through the wind or the cold clashing of chains, but the flickering beat of drums merging with bare feet pounding the dusty earth. The rulers, sitting on their high balconies, sipped their wine and smiled complacently as they watched their slaves spinning in a wild dance. They thought it was the foolish release of the wretched, the submission of broken souls. But they had no idea that right beneath their watchful eyes, those sweat-drenched bodies were not dancing for amusement. Every spin was a concealed lethal blow. Every momentum gained was a tactical exercise. The great warriors of the Dark Continent were silently sharpening their claws right inside the enemy's iron cage. They used music to camouflage military tactics. They used dance to lull the vigilance of death itself. And when that music suddenly stopped, the rulers' smiles would be forever frozen by the most terrifying bloodbath in plantation history. If you are passionate about the great hidden corners of history and long to understand the extraordinary power of humanity in the face of adversity, please hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment below this video to support us in continuing to uncover forgotten pages of history. The journey shall now begin. History never begins at the moment a sword is swung or a drop of blood is spilled. It always originates from a much deeper place, from roots that were once firmly planted in the motherland before being ruthlessly torn away. To understand the fire of hatred and the burning desire for freedom hidden within those seemingly harmless dance steps, one must go back in time to the distant lands across the Atlantic. That is the African continent, where the sun rises with primordial majesty, bathing vast plains and mighty kingdoms in gold. There, men and women were not silent shadows, but proud hunters, brave warriors, and sages carrying the flow of ancestral wisdom. They lived in harmony with the breath of the great forests, where every step carried the pride of a free land. Those warriors were trained not only to fight but to protect the sacredness of their lineage. However, the wheel of fate turned its most cruel revolutions when white sails appeared on the horizon, bringing the bottomless greed of those who called themselves the enlightened. Villages were engulfed in seas of fire. Screams tore through the peaceful night. Great warriors were surrounded by weapons they had never seen, struck down not by a lack of courage, but by the cruelty of colonial schemes. They were dragged away from the land that had nurtured them since birth, stripped of their identities, stripped of all glory to become inanimate merchandise in a market trading human flesh and blood. When the doors of the coastal fortresses slammed shut behind them, it was also the moment they realized half of their souls would forever remain with the mother continent. No longer the protectors of the kingdom, they now bore the bleeding scars of shackles. But even in the darkest moment of exile, when their bodies were trampled and their futures dictated by a price tag, there was one thing the slave hunters could never touch. That was memory. The memory of secret martial arts. The memory of drumbeats urging courage. The memory of a time they once held their heads high under a free sky. It was that invisible memory that became the most resilient seed, hidden deep within the hearts of the exiled children, carried onto the hell ships to cross the stormy ocean. They knew that this body might be chained, but the spirit of a warrior never dies. It is only falling into a deep winter sleep, waiting for a call powerful enough to awaken and reclaim what was lost. The wooden belly of the beast swallowed them whole, plunging proud warriors into an abyss where time and space dissolved into an agonizing eternity. This was not merely a vessel of exploration traversing the vast waters, but a floating tomb meticulously designed to strip away the very essence of human dignity. In the suffocating darkness of the ship's hold, the air grew incredibly thick with a metallic scent of blood, the acrid sting of sweat, and the heavy, suffocating weight of collective despair. Men who had once commanded the vast, sun-drenched savannas now found themselves chained shoulder to shoulder, their mighty limbs bound by cold iron that bit mercilessly into their flesh with every pitch and roll of the unforgiving ocean. The symphony of the Atlantic waves crashing against the wooden hull was drowned out by a haunting chorus of anguished moans, a deeply tragic melody of souls being violently severed from their ancestral roots. They were suspended in a horrifying liminal space, no longer belonging to the vibrant, pulsing earth of their birth, yet not having arrived at the nightmare that awaited them on distant shores. The captors walking the decks above viewed them merely as cargo, a cold calculation of profit and loss, utterly blind to the royal bloodlines, the ancient wisdom, and the fierce warrior spirit pulsating in the veins of the bound captives below. It was within this profound, the suffocating darkness that the first true lesson of survival in the New World was forged. Stripped of their weapons, their honorary titles, and the vast open skies they once roamed with absolute freedom, these exiled sons and daughters of the continent realized that the battlefield had fundamentally shifted. Physical resistance against the armed gods and the endless, terrifying expanse of the surrounding sea was a futile endeavor that would only invite the cold, immediate embrace of death. Therefore, a silent, sacred pact was sealed in the shadows, communicated not through spoken words, but through the shared rhythm of heavy breathing and the steady, defiant beating of their hearts. They learned to retreat inward, to build impenetrable fortresses within the vast landscapes of their own minds, where the oppressor's whip and the chains of bondage could never reach. The physical body might be confined, malnourished, and battered beyond recognition, but the spirit, that eternal flame passed down through countless generations of proud ancestors, had to be fiercely protected and nurtured at all costs. As the endless days bled seamlessly into endless nights, the fragmented tribes and distinct peoples thrown together in the belly of the ship began to experience a profound and painful metamorphosis. The shared trauma acted as a brutal crucible, melting away old rivalries and linguistic barriers, forging a new, unbreakable solidarity born of mutual suffering. They whispered ancient chants into the darkness, barely audible hums that carried the sacred rhythms of the motherland, desperately preserving their sanity, their history, and their core identity. This was the genesis of a new kind of warrior, one who deeply understood that patience was not synonymous with surrender, and endurance was not the equivalent of defeat. They were learning the agonizing art of biding their time, internalizing their immense strength, and transforming their profound suffering into a silent, simmering reservoir of pure power. The ocean journey was a deliberate, systematic attempt to break them, to erase their humanity entirely and mold them into docile beasts of burden. Yet, beneath the layers of unimaginable physical and psychological torment, an unyielding core of resilience was being tempered like fine steel in a dark, suffocating forge. They were no longer just survivors clinging to life. They were the potent seeds of future rebellion being carried across the waters, harboring a dormant but incredibly lethal energy that would one day erupt with earth-shattering force when the time was precisely right. Every agonizing breath drawn in the foul, stagnant air of the hold was a deliberate act of defiance, a silent vow made to the ancestors to live long enough to see the sun again, not as broken slaves, but as patient warriors waiting in the shadows for the ultimate day of reckoning. When the heavy wooden doors of the hold were finally thrown open, it was not salvation that greeted them, but the blinding, cruel light of a strange and barren anchor. The air here tasted different, thick with an unfamiliar humidity and the sickeningly sweet scent of impending doom. Stumbling onto the docks of the new world, their eyes, accustomed to weeks of absolute darkness, squinted against a sun that felt utterly alien, offering no warmth, only a glaring spotlight on their absolute wretchedness. Here, on the auction blocks crafted from the very wood that would soon build their prisons, the final illusion of their past lives was ruthlessly shattered. They were poked, prodded, and examined like beasts of the field. Their physical strength, the very attribute that once made them revered protectors of their homelands, now transformed into the exact metric of their monetary value. Families were torn apart with the casual indifference of a hand waving away a fly, screams of separation echoing against the stone walls of the harbor, ignored by men whose hearts had been thoroughly hardened by the relentless pursuit of wealth. The destination was the vast, sprawling sugarcane plantations, an ocean of endless green that swallowed men whole and spat out nothing but sorrow and refined sweetness for distant European tables. The soil of this new world was incredibly fertile, but it demanded a terrible, unending sacrifice. It was a barren anchor not in its agricultural yield, but in its absolute devoidness of humanity and hope. From the moment the sun breached the horizon to the very last fading light of dusk, the exiled warriors were forced to bend their backs to the earth, wielding machetes that should have been weapons of defense, now reduced to tools of endless agricultural toil. The sugarcane fields became a sprawling, inescapable purgatory. The sharp leaves sliced mercilessly into their skin, mixing the salt of their sweat with the crimson of their blood, watering the foreign soil with the life force of a displaced people. The relentless crack of the overseer's whip served as the cruel metronome of their daily existence, a constant stinging reminder of their subjugated reality. To the eyes of the plantation owners, who sat comfortably on their shaded verandas fanning away the tropical heat, the breaking process appeared highly successful. They saw only bowed heads, exhausted bodies moving in a synchronized rhythm of forced labor, and eyes that stared blankly at the dirt. They believed they had successfully domesticated the wildness of the African continent, transforming fierce lions into obedient oxen. However, this assumption was born of a profound and fatal arrogance. The masters looked, but they did not truly see. They failed to comprehend that a warrior forced to his knees does not necessarily forget how to stand. He simply learns to study the ground beneath him, feeling its vibrations, understanding its texture, and preparing for the precise moment to push back with devastating force. Beneath the facade of absolute compliance, a brilliant and desperate strategy of survival was taking deep root. The exiles realized that open defiance in the face of overwhelming firepower and organized brutality would only result in swift, meaningless slaughter. To survive the barren anchor, they had to become masters of illusion. They learned to mask the burning fury in their eyes with a veil of dull obedience. They allowed their bodies to perform the excruciating labor demanded of them, using the very act of swinging the heavy machetes to maintain their physical conditioning, turning back-breaking work into a disguised form of grueling strength training. The earth that absorbed their blood and sweat became their silent confidant, holding their pain while they quietly rebuilt their fragmented minds. They were not broken. They were merely adapting to a hostile environment, employing the ancient wisdom of the hunted to outsmart the hunter. In the suffocating heat of the sugarcane fields, the seeds of a bloody rebellion were not dying. They were patiently germinating beneath the surface, feeding on the very oppression designed to destroy them, waiting for the first drop of rain to awaken their dormant, terrifying power. The systematic dismantling of a human being is a gruesome architecture of pain, designed not merely to extract labor, but to utterly extinguish the profound inner light that defines existence. On the sprawling, sun-scorched plantations of the New World, the masters deployed every conceivable instrument of torment to achieve this dark objective. The physical body, once a magnificent vessel of grace and power that moved with the absolute freedom of the African savannas, was methodically reduced to a raw, bleeding canvas of subjugation. The overseer's whip carved intricate maps of agony into their backs, a cruel calligraphy of ownership that sought to rewrite their identities in the ink of their own blood. Starvation was weaponized to hollow out their strength, turning towering warriors into gaunt silhouettes trembling under the weight of the sugarcane bundles. Exhaustion was a constant, suffocating blanket, deliberately engineered to strip away the energy required for even the simplest acts of memory or hope. The masters believed with supreme arrogance that by conquering the flesh, by chaining the limbs and bruising the bone, they were inevitably conquering the mind. They operated under the profound delusion that a broken body must naturally house a broken spirit, failing entirely to understand the ancient, unyielding architecture of the African soul. However, beneath the horrific spectacle of physical devastation, an invisible and impenetrable sanctuary was being fiercely guarded. The physical world of the plantation, the endless rows of cane, the blinding heat, the heavy iron shackles, and the wooden shacks of the slave quarters was a realm of absolute captivity. Yet, the internal universe of the exiled warriors remained a vast, untouchable expanse of boundless freedom. When the grueling labor of the day finally concluded and the heavy curtain of the tropical night fell over the compound, the true life of the enslaved began in the shadowed silence, lying on the damp earth of the Saints-Oles, their bodies throbbing with an agony that defied description. They engaged in a profound act of spiritual defiance. They closed their weary eyes and immediately transcended the brutal confines of their reality. In the boundless theater of their minds, they were no longer nameless property listed on a ledger. They returned to the majestic rivers of their homelands. They walked alongside the revered spirits of their ancestors. They heard the sacred proverbs of the village elders echoing through the corridors of their memory. This internal migration was not mere escapism. It was a vital, desperate mechanism of spiritual preservation. To extinguish the body is a matter of brute force, but to extinguish a soul requires the victim's ultimate surrender. A surrender these warriors absolutely refused to grant. They understood with crystalline clarity that the oppressor could command their sweat, their blood, and their waking hours, but the oppressor could never lay claim to the sacred territory of their thoughts. Their colonizers could chain their wrists, but they could never chain the majestic lineage of kings, queens, and fierce protectors that flowed through their veins. This profound realization became the unshakable bedrock of their resilience. They began to cultivate a dual existence, a masterful compartmentalization of being. Outwardly, they wore the tragic mask of the subjugated, eyes downcast, voices muted, shoulders slumped in a performance of utter defeat that perfectly satisfied the arrogant gaze of the slave master. Inwardly, however, the flame of rebellion was meticulously tended, fed by the invisible fuel of ancestral pride and an unwavering, quiet rage. This preservation of the soul amidst the absolute destruction of the body was the greatest, most silent victory of the diaspora. It was a profound philosophical triumph over a system designed to reduce them to the status of beasts. They communicated this unbroken spirit through subtle glances, through the shared cadence of a work song that carried hidden layers of meaning, and through the quiet dignity with which they tended to each other's wounds in the dead of night. They were forging a new identity in the crucible of unimaginable suffering, an identity that was forged in pain but defined by an immortal, transcendent strength. The masters looked upon the bleeding, scarred backs of their captives and saw the absolute triumph of their brutal empire, entirely blind to the terrifying reality that they had merely succeeded in burying a seed of pure, volatile energy deep within the fertile soil of extreme oppression. The physical form was indeed being crushed into the dust, but from that very dust, the unconquerable soul was preparing to rise, armed not yet with steel, but with an indestructible will to reclaim its stolen humanity. The human body, when denied the explicit tools of warfare, possesses a miraculous capacity to transform itself into the weapon it so desperately needs. For the exiled warriors, trapped within a system where the mere possession of a blade or a hardened stick was punishable by immediate death, the path to liberation could not be forged through conventional armaments. They were under the constant, paranoid surveillance of men who saw the shadow of rebellion in every gathered crowd and every whispered conversation. Open military training was an absolute impossibility, a guaranteed death sentence that would extinguish their smoldering revolution before it could even catch fire. Therefore, necessity, the harshest and most demanding of teachers, birthed a masterpiece of lethal deception. They looked to the only element of their culture that the colonizers tolerated, and sometimes even encouraged: their music and their dance. The masters, in their profound ignorance, viewed the rhythmic movements and percussive sounds of the slaves as a harmless release of primitive energy, a necessary valve to keep the human machinery functioning. They could not fathom that this allowed space of cultural expression was about to be weaponized. The camouflage was executed with a brilliance that bordered on the divine. The warriors began to meticulously embed the deadly mechanics of their ancestral martial arts into the fluid, hypnotic rhythms of a tribal dance. What appeared to the untrained, arrogant eye of the overseer as a chaotic, acrobatic display of leisure was, in reality, a highly structured, intensely disciplined academy of war. The sweeping, circular kicks designed to shatter a man's ribs or sweep his legs from beneath him were beautifully disguised as exuberant, sweeping dance steps. The sudden ground-level sweeps and acrobatic handstands were not mere displays of agility. They were calculated, evasive maneuvers, training the body to drop beneath the trajectory of a musket ball or a swinging blade and counterattack from an unseen angle. The continuous, swaying motion, the ginga, was not just a rhythmic keeping of time. It was the fundamental stance of an ever-shifting warrior, a state of constant, deceptive motion that made it impossible for an enemy to predict the next strike. They were hiding their deadly intent in plain sight, wrapping the brutal geometry of combat in the mesmerizing silk of a cultural performance. When Sunday arrived, the one brief day of rest granted to the captives, the dusty clearings between the slave quarters transformed into a theater of magnificent deception. That the drums would begin to beat, setting a pulsing, irresistible rhythm that seemed to call out to the very heartbeat of the earth. The warriors would step into the center of the circle, their bodies gleaming with sweat, moving with a grace and explosive power that was nothing short of to the master watching from his distant porch, nursing his rum and smoking his pipe. It was a comforting confirmation of his absolute dominance, his property entertaining themselves in the dirt. He saw wide smiles, he heard rhythmic chanting, and he watched bodies spinning in what he believed was an ecstatic, harmless trance. He did not see the eyes of the dancers locking onto one another, calculating distance, timing, and vulnerabilities. He did not understand that the smile was a deliberate mask of mockery, a shield of feigned joy hiding the lethal focus of a soldier preparing for a bloodbath. This ingenious synchronization of martial arts and rhythmic performance achieved something truly profound. It allowed the enslaved to maintain their peak physical conditioning, to sharpen their reflexes, and to drill complex combat scenarios right under the noses of their captors. It also served as a powerful unspoken language of unity. Through the shared rhythm, they were transmitting the codes of resistance to the younger generations, ensuring that the ancient knowledge of warfare was not lost to the brutality of the plantation. The dance became a living, breathing archive of their military heritage, encoded in muscle memory and sustained by the beat of the drum. It was a sublime irony of history that the very mechanism the oppressors permitted to pacify their slaves became the precise instrument of their terrifying undoing. The warriors were essentially sharpening their blades on the very chains that bound them, turning the rhythm of their sorrow into the steady, approaching drumbeat of a terrifying retribution. Every spin, every kick, and every perfectly timed evasion was a silent promise made to the ancestors. The music would not play forever, and when the rhythm finally ceased, the true dance of survival would begin. To the uninitiated ear, music is merely an arrangement of sounds designed to soothe the mind or inspire fleeting physical movement. However, in the crucible of the New World plantations, sound was transformed into a profound instrument of survival, a sophisticated mechanism of communication, and a sacred bridge connecting the agonizing present to a glorious, unforgotten past. At the absolute center of this auditory rebellion stood a remarkably simple yet profoundly powerful instrument, the bur, constructed from a single, arched wooden bow, a metal wire salvaged from the refuse of the plantation, and a hollowed-out gourd acting as a resonator. It appeared as impoverished and broken as the captive bodies that surrounded it. Yet, when a calloused hand struck that solitary wire with a slender stick, the resulting vibration was not a melody of submission. It was a sharp, metallic twang that tore through the humid tropical air like a spiritual lightning bolt, an ancient metallic cry that resonated with the very frequency of the African soul. The berimbau was not designed to entertain, it was forged to command. It became the absolute heartbeat of the disguised martial art, the unquestioned general of the shadowed army, dictating every breath, every strike, and every evasion of the warriors trapped within the circle. The philosophy of the berimbau was deeply rooted in the understanding that warfare is inextricably linked to rhythm and timing. In the sprawling, dusty courtyards of the slave quarters, the man who held the instrument held the absolute authority of a military commander. The tempo he dictated was a complex, coded language of survival that completely bypassed the comprehension of the heavily armed overseers standing just yards away. When the heavy, sorrowful rhythm of the Angola beat echoed across the dirt, it commanded the fighters to move low to the ground, to practice the agonizingly slow, calculated mechanics of balance, leverage, and deceptive vulnerability. It was a rhythm of immense patience, teaching the exiled sons and daughters how to survive when trapped in the tightest of corners, emphasizing endurance and cunning over brute force. But the Barambo was also a vigilant sentinel. If the sharp eyes of the musician spotted the plantation master or a vicious overseer approaching the gathering, the rhythm would instantaneously shift, the frantic warning beat of the cavaleria mimicking the terrifying sound of approaching cavalry. Hoovers would immediately ring out. In a fraction of a second, without a single spoken word, the lethal sweeping kicks and devastating strikes of the fighters would dissolve seamlessly into a joyful, chaotic dance of harmless acrobatics. The martial academy vanished into thin air, replaced by a theatrical performance of docile servitude. This solitary stringed instrument was the keeper of a profound spiritual clock, ticking down the days, months, and years of their captivity. The deep guttural resonance of the gourd did not just dictate the physical movements of the fighters, it called out to the displaced spirits of their ancestors, drawing their immense, unseen power across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean to fortify the broken bodies in the road of the circular boundary of the fight. The warriors believed with absolute conviction that as long as the Barambo sang its metallic song, they were completely shielded from the ultimate degradation of their souls. The music provided an invisible armor, a psychological sanctuary where the brutal reality of their enslavement was temporarily suspended. The singing of the chorus, responding to the call of the lead musician, wove a thick tapestry of collective memory, recounting ancient battles, legendary kings, and the bittersweet sorrow of their stolen homeland. The colonizers, in their profound ignorance, heard only a primitive noise, a cacophony of sorrow and sweat. They entirely failed to realize that the twang of the wire and the steady shake of the caxixi rattle were, in fact, the meticulous ticking of a terrible, inescapable time bomb. The Baramba was not singing a lullaby to comfort the oppressed. It was intensely focused on chanting the complex, bloody mathematics of a looming revolution. Every strike of the stick against the wire was meticulously calibrating the collective wrath of a stolen people, orchestrating a silent symphony of vengeance that would only unleash its devastating crescendo when the music finally, inevitably, stopped. To understand the profound success of this magnificent deception, one must descend from the dusty, blood-stained earth of the slave quarters and step onto the elevated, shaded verandas of the plantation's big house. From this vantage point of architectural and social supremacy, the oppressor gazed down upon the world he believed he entirely controlled. The colonizer was intoxicated not only by the rum distilled from the immense suffering of his captives but by a profound, blinding hubris. He was thoroughly convinced of his own inherent superiority, entirely indoctrinated by a philosophical and economic system that violently categorized the dark-skinned inhabitants of his estate as subhuman creatures devoid of complex intellect, strategic foresight, or the capacity for organized, sophisticated rebellion. This deeply ingrained arrogance was his most fatal vulnerability. When the master looked down and saw his property gathering in a circle on a Sunday afternoon, swaying to the hypnotic rhythms of the drums and the strange, solitary wire of the Baramba, his mind processed the scene through a lens of absolute racial supremacy. He did not perceive a highly organized military academy. He saw a pathetic, almost childlike release of primal energy. The psychological architecture of the oppressor required him to but believe that his slaves were either completely broken by his relentless brutality or naturally predisposed to docile servitude. The sight of the rotor, the circle of disguised combat, perfectly reinforced this comforting delusion. The master watched the athletic sweeping movements, the acrobatic leaps, and the low spinning sweeps, and he smiled with the profound satisfaction of an owner admiring the physical prowess of his livestock. He occasionally clapped his pale hands to the rhythm, utterly oblivious to the terrifying reality that he was literally applauding the very men who were silently rehearsing his violent execution. He believed the smiles on the faces of the fighters were expressions of simple, mindless joy, a grateful acceptance of the brief respite he had so benevolently granted them. He was tragically blind to the complex, psychological warfare occurring right before his eyes. The smile of the enslaved warrior in the circle was not an expression of happiness. It was a highly calculated mask, a deliberate mockery designed to soothe the paranoia of the overseers while hiding a gaze that was calculating distance, identifying anatomical weaknesses, and perfecting the precise angle required to snap a human neck. The irony of this historical moment is almost suffocating in its magnitude. The vast wealth of the plantation, the opulent clothing, the fine imported wines, and the heavily armed guards all created a magnificent illusion of absolute security for the ruling class. Yet, their security was entirely dependent on their absolute failure to comprehend the humanity of those they oppressed. Because they refused to see the captive as a man, they could not foresee the captive as a soldier. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of human resilience, believing that a body subjected to the whip and the chain would naturally forfeit the desire for sovereignty. The master, sitting comfortably in his rocking chair, failed to realize that his plantation was not merely an agricultural enterprise, but a pressure cooker of profound human agony, and the very cultural practices he permitted to release that pressure were quietly forging a weapon of unparalleled lethality. The colonizer lived in a comfortable, sunlit dream of perpetual dominance, entirely unaware that he was standing on the extremely thin crust of a dormant volcano. Below him, in the shadows, disguised by rhythm and song, the magma of ancestral fury was rising, meticulously guided by the unbreakable discipline of warriors who had learned to weaponize their own degradation. The master's gaze was entirely conquered by the illusion, making him the most tragic, unknowing participant in the meticulously choreographed dance of his own impending demise. When the burning sun finally relented and slipped beneath the horizon of the sugarcane sea, the world of the plantation underwent a profound and terrifying metamorphosis. For the colonizer, the night was a time of vulnerability, a dark expanse to be held at bay by heavy wooden doors, iron locks, and the loaded muskets of the patrolling overseers. But for the enslaved, the night was a vast, subterranean kingdom of liberation, a cloaked sanctuary where the crushing weight of their chains could be temporarily cast aside. The darkness was not an enemy, it was their oldest, most faithful ally, a thick, velvet curtain behind which the intricate architecture of revolution was being meticulously assembled. Communication, heavily policed and brutally punished under the blazing light of day, transformed into a highly sophisticated, spectral language of the night. The exiled warriors understood that an isolated uprising on a single estate would be swiftly and mercilessly crushed by the overwhelming military might of the empire. To truly shatter the colossal machinery of slavery, they needed to weave a vast, invisible web of solidarity that stretched across the heavily guarded borders of the surrounding plantations. The mechanism of this secret diplomacy was breathtaking in its ingenuity. It relied on the very sounds the masters had dismissed as primitive noise. In the dead of night, the hollow, reverberating strike of a wooden drum or the sharp, metallic twang of the berimbau would drift across the humid valleys, carrying far beyond the confines of a single farm. To the white overseer smoking his pipe on the porch, it was merely the mournful echoing of restless savages in the distance. To the initiated warrior lying awake in a neighboring senzala, it was a precise, coded telegram. The rhythms held complex syllables, dictating the movements of patrols, the exact numbers of available men, and the shifting timelines of the impending storm. It was a gossamer thread of sound connecting broken families and fragmented tribes, forging a unified, invisible army out of isolated, bleeding individuals. The drumming was an auditory map of rebellion, charting a course toward freedom through a landscape dominated by absolute terror. But the secret language extended far beyond the realm of sound. It permeated their physical existence, giving birth to a silent, everyday code of conduct known to the fighters as militia, a profound, survivalist cunning. This was the profound alchemy of transforming subjugation into a weapon of espionage. A specific, seemingly accidental stumble while carrying a bundle of cane could signal a hidden cache of stolen gunpowder. The particular way a man wiped the sweat from his brow could confirm that a message had been successfully relayed. Even the most ordinary glance across the endless rows of crops became a loaded exchange of intelligence. They were living dual lives, their physical bodies enslaved to the earth, while their minds operated as highly trained operatives in a covert, continental war. The oppressor demanded absolute transparency, requiring the slaves to be entirely readable, devoid of internal complexity or hidden intent. In profound defiance, the warriors became walking enigmas, burying their burning hatred and their meticulously crafted military strategies beneath an impenetrable layer of feigned ignorance. They weaponized the master's own prejudice, using his deeply ingrained belief in their intellectual inferiority as the ultimate cloak of invisibility. The night taught them that true power does not always roar. Sometimes, the most devastating power is the one that learns to whisper in the shadows, to flow like water beneath locked doors, and to unite 1,000 broken hearts into a single, terrifying pulse of imminent retribution. There is a highly specific, almost suffocating atmospheric pressure that descends upon the earth in the final, agonizing hours before a massive storm breaks. The air becomes unnaturally still, the leaves refuse to rustle, and every living creature holds its breath in instinctual anticipation of the violent rupture to come. This identical, heavy silence fell over the sprawling plantations on the eve of the rebellion. The sheer magnitude of what they were about to attempt hung in the humid air, an invisible, electric current that connected every man, woman, and child who had been initiated into the deadly secret. They had spent years, perhaps decades, swallowing their pride, suppressing their fierce warrior instincts, and meticulously sharpening their bodies into lethal instruments of war under the guise of an acrobatic dance. Now, the grand illusion was drawing to its terrifying conclusion. The endless rehearsals were over. The bloody premiere was at hand. The psychological shift within the enslaved population was profound and incredibly dangerous, for it required them to perform the most difficult acting of their lives. They had to wake up to the sound of the overseer's horn, walk out into the blinding sun, and pick up their heavy machetes while completely containing the explosive, atomic energy of a fully awakened army. Yet, Despite their absolute mastery of deception, tiny uncontrollable fractures began to appear in the facade of their subjugation. The physical posture of the captive fundamentally altered. For years, survival had depended on looking down, offering the top of one's head in a gesture of absolute, unthreatening submission. But on this final day, the eyes of the warriors began to subtly involuntarily lift. When the whip cracked nearby, they no longer flinched with the customary terror. Instead, their dark eyes tracked the leather strap, cold and calculating, measuring the exact distance to the man wielding it. The calloused, permanently scarred hands that gripped the agricultural tools began to clench with a different kind of tension. They were no longer merely holding implements of endless, crushing labor. They were familiarizing themselves with the precise weight and balance of the weapons that would soon sever the chains of their bondage. Inside the suffocating heat of the slave quarters that evening, there was no festive drumming, no exuberant singing to placate the watchful eyes of the guards. A heavy, sacred solemnity had entirely consumed the space. The elders, the spiritual architects of the movement, moved quietly among the muscular, scarred bodies of the young fighters, whispering ancient prayers of protection and painting invisible symbols of invulnerability upon their dark skin with the ash of the cooking fires. They were mentally crossing the great, terrifying precipice that separates a victim from an agent of history. Every individual in that shadowy room understood the catastrophic mathematics of their decision. They knew intimately that by tomorrow night, the fertile soil of the plantation would be saturated not just with their sweat, but with a horrifying torrent of blood. Many of them would not live to see the dawn of their newly won freedom. Their bodies would be broken by lead and steel. Yet, this terrifying reality did not breed hesitation. The fear of death had been utterly eclipsed by the infinitely more terrifying prospect of living one more day as a piece of breathing property. The agonizing wait was finally over. The invisible spring, compressed by years of unspeakable torture, degradation, and silent, rhythmic preparation, was locked in its absolute final position. All that remained was for the master to make his customary appearance, for the sun to reach its zenith, and for the agonizingly beautiful, perfectly deceptive music of the berimbau to suddenly, violently, and permanently stop. There is a profound, terrifying way to a sudden silence that follows years of uninterrupted noise. For generations, the auditory landscape of the plantation had been entirely dictated by the oppressor. The sharp, tearing crack of the leather whip, the heavy, rhythmic clanking of iron chains, the arrogant shouts of the overseers, and the weeping of mothers torn from their children. Even the music permitted on Sundays, the pulsing drums and the metallic hum of the berimbau, was perceived by the masters as merely another layer of this controlled environment. A harmless acoustic exhaust valve for their human machinery. They had grown profoundly comfortable with this symphony of subjugation, entirely oblivious to the reality that the rhythm they so casually enjoyed was actually a meticulously calculated countdown. On that fateful, sweltering afternoon, as the master sat upon his elevated wooden veranda, swirling a glass of imported rum and gazing down at the dusty courtyard with a benevolent, patronizing smile, the universe of the new world was about to be violently inverted. Down in the blinding sun, the warriors were spinning in the rhoda, their bodies gleaming with sweat, executing acrobatic leaps and low sweeps with a mesmerizing, terrifying velocity. The music was reaching a frantic, hypnotic crescendo, drawing the armed guards into a state of relaxed, entertained complacency. Then, in a fraction of a second, the ancient and invisible thread of history snapped. A single, imperceptible glance was exchanged between the elder holding the stringed bow and the lead warrior inside the circle. Without a warning shout, without a single raised weapon, the stick ceased striking the metal wire. The heavy hands of the drummers froze entirely in midair above the stretched animal skins. The complex, pulsating rhythm that had defined their captivity simply vanished, leaving behind a vacuum of sound so sudden and so absolute that it seemed to suck the very oxygen from the humid tropical air. For one agonizing, stretched moment of suspended animation, the colonizers did not comprehend what had just occurred. The master's smile remained frozen on his face, his mind struggling to process the abrupt cessation of his entertainment. The overseers, leaning lazily against the wooden fences with their muskets resting by their sides, frowned in mild irritation, waiting for the slaves to resume their primitive dance. They were trapped in the fatal arrogance of their supremacy, unable to read the catastrophic atmospheric shift that had just taken place right in front of their eyes. They did not understand that the music had not stopped because the dancers were tired. The music had stopped because the camouflage was no longer required. The silence was the ultimate command. The kinetic energy that had been violently swirling within the boundaries of the dance circle did not dissipate into the air. It instantly crystallized into pure, unadulterated lethality. The warrior who had been in the midst of a low rhythmic sway, the deceptive jinga, did not pause. Instead, he seamlessly transferred the immense centrifugal force of his movement into a devastating, upward strike. The hardened edge of his calloused heel connected with the jaw of the nearest armed overseer with a sickening, definitive crunch that echoed like a gunshot across the silent courtyard. The guard's neck snapped back, his musket falling uselessly into the dust as his body crumpled to the earth. It was the first drop of blood spilled in the name of retribution. a crimson seal, permanently shattering the illusion of the unbroken slave. Up on the veranda, the glass of rum slipped from the master's trembling fingers, shattering into 1,000 glistening pieces on the wooden floorboards. In that microscopic fraction of time, as he stared down at the sprawling, chaotic violence erupting in his courtyard, his entire philosophical worldview collapsed entirely upon itself. He realized, with a cold, suffocating terror, that he had not been domesticating beasts of burden. He had been personally funding, feeding, and entirely ignoring a highly disciplined academy of lethal, vengeful ghosts. The era of the whip had ended. The agonizing era of the blade and the blood had spectacularly begun. What unfolded in the suffocating heat of that courtyard was not a disorganized riot of desperate men, but a magnificent, terrifying ballet of absolute destruction. The martial art incubated in the dark hold of the slave ships and perfected under the blinding sun of the sugarcane fields was finally entirely unleashed in its true, unmasked form. The European overseers, trained in the rigid, linear tactics of musket formations and open-field combat, found themselves completely entirely overwhelmed by an enemy that moved like a violently swirling tempest. They tried to raise their heavy firearms, but the warriors did not stand still to be executed. The acrobatic evasions they had practiced for years, dropping flat to the earth, executing rapid handsprings and spinning completely out of the line of fire, made them almost impossible to track. Before a guard could pull the heavy iron trigger, a sweeping crescent kick, powered by the immense, coiled strength of a man who had chopped cane for a decade, would shatter his ribs or sweep his legs out from underneath him. The very chains that had bound their wrists were snatched up from the dirt and weaponized, transformed into whistling instruments of blunt force trauma that cracked the skulls of the oppressors with terrifying efficiency. The battlefield was a chaotic masterpiece of circular motion and explosive, deceptive strikes. A warrior would appear to be retreating, stumbling backward in an apparent display of fear, only to plant his hands firmly in the blood-soaked dirt and launch both feet directly into the chest of his pursuer, a technique perfected through countless Sundays of disguised practice. They fought with a profound, terrifying silence, conserving every ounce of their breath for the physical exertion of the slaughter, their eyes burning with the accumulated agony of generations. This was not merely a fight for physical survival, it was a profound, spiritual exorcism. Every blow struck against the white flesh of the gods was an attempt to violently purge the degradation from their own souls, to reclaim the sovereign dignity that had been stolen from them across the Atlantic Ocean. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and crimson, the flames of rebellion were physically ignited. Torches were thrown onto the dry, thatched roofs of the storage barns and into the sprawling, endless oceans of sugarcane. The plantation, the monumental engine of their endless suffering, it was rapidly consumed by a roaring, purifying inferno. The fire illuminated the night with a hellish dancing glow, casting long, monstrous shadows of the fighters against the white walls of the burning big house. The masters, those who had not already been struck down in the initial, breathtaking surge of violence, were fleeing in absolute terror into the surrounding jungles, abandoning their wealth, their titles, and their profound delusions of racial superiority. The warriors did not mindlessly pursue them into the darkness. They stood amidst the roaring flames and the smoking ruins of their former prison, their bare chests heaving, their dark skin slick with a mixture of sweat and the blood of their captors. They had achieved the impossible. Through an unparalleled masterpiece of human endurance and intellectual cunning, they had inverted the absolute power structure of the New World. They had transformed the rhythm of their sorrow into a weapon of mass liberation. As they looked at the burning mansion, a new, spontaneous rhythm began to slowly emerge from the exhausted survivors. It was not the fast, deceptive beat of the Sunday performance, but a slow, deep, mournful stomping of bare feet against the liberated earth, a solemn acknowledgement of the immense price paid and the terrifying, a beautiful journey that now lay ahead in the untamed wilderness. The dance of death was over. The march toward absolute freedom had begun. The immediate aftermath of a successful uprising is an incredibly fragile, disorienting space suspended between the intoxicating euphoria of sudden liberation and the terrifying reality of an unknown future. As the majestic, consuming flames of the sugarcane plantation painted the night sky in violent hues of orange and crimson, the victorious warriors did not linger to revel in the ashes of their former prison. They possessed a profound, tactical understanding that the destruction of a single estate was merely the opening tremor of an impending colossal earthquake. The empire of the colonizers was a vast, heavily armed leviathan, and the smoke rising from the burning big house would inevitably serve as a beacon, drawing the ruthless, mechanized wrath of imperial military expeditions. Therefore, the decision was made in absolute, unified silence, turning their backs on the smoldering ruins and the corpses of their oppressors. The newly liberated men, women, and children stepped away from the cultivated, blood-soaked earth of the valley and plunged themselves entirely into the dense, formidable embrace of the untamed jungle. This was not a chaotic flight of terrified fugitives. It was a highly organized, strategic exodus, a deliberate march into a primordial wilderness that the Europeans viewed with profound, superstitious dread. The transition from the rigid, geometric confines of the plantation to the chaotic, boundless architecture of the rainforest required a fundamental psychological metamorphosis. For years, their spatial reality had been strictly defined by straight lines, the endless rows of sugarcane, the perfectly measured wooden fences, the square, suffocating dimensions of the slave quarters. The jungle, however, was a magnificent, twisting labyrinth of ancient vines, towering canopies that entirely blotted out the sunlight, and treacherous shifting topography. To the European overseers, the forest was a terrifying abyss of venomous serpents, lethal diseases, and impenetrable darkness. But to the exiled sons and daughters of the African continent, the jungle offered a profound, spiritual homecoming. As their bare calloused feet sank into the damp, decomposing leaves of the forest floor, a deep ancestral memory was violently awakened within their blood. They recognized the whispering language of the wind through the high branches. They understood the hidden, rhythmic pulses of the ecosystem, the very environment that served as a terrifying, impenetrable wall to their heavily armored pursuers became, for the warriors, a vast, welcoming sanctuary. They utilized the incredible physical agility and profound spatial awareness they had meticulously cultivated in their disguised martial arts, training to navigate the treacherous terrain with silent, ghostly precision. The acrobatic evasions designed to dodge a slaver's blade were seamlessly adapted to duck beneath razor-sharp branches and leap silently across rushing rocky streams. They left absolutely no footprints in the mud, deliberately bending ferns back into place and walking in single file, stepping perfectly into the tracks of the person ahead, effectively rendering a massive exodus of hundreds of people entirely invisible to the tracking dogs and the furious bounty hunters who would soon follow. This arduous, grueling journey through the unforgiving wilderness was, in essence, a profound ritual of purification. With every mile they pushed deeper into the emerald shadows, the heavy, suffocating psychological residue of slavery was slowly, agonizingly stripped away. They were shedding the traumatic identities forced upon them by the auction block and the ledger. The names given to them by their masters were spoken for the very last time and deliberately left behind in the damp earth, replaced by the proud, ancestral names of their grandfathers and the warrior titles they had rightfully earned in the hidden circles of the Rhoda. When they finally reached the highest, most inaccessible plateaus of the mountainous interior, surrounded by sheer cliffs and entirely shrouded by perpetual mists, they halted their march. Here, suspended between the earth and the sky, in a geography that defied the reach of the colonial mapmaker, they drove their staffs into the soil not as tools of agricultural labor, but as the foundational pillars of a new, sovereign nation. They had successfully broken the absolute encirclement of the transatlantic slave system. They had dragged themselves out of the abyss of human degradation and stood, breathing heavily in the thin, cool mountain air, as the absolute masters of their own destiny. This elevated, hidden sanctuary was not merely a physical refuge, it was the manifestation of an unconquerable philosophical ideal. It was the birth of the Quilombo, a sacred, autonomous territory where the horrific concept of human ownership was permanently abolished, and where the rhythm of the Barambo would never again be used to camouflage their strength, but would proudly ring out as the unyielding anthem of a free and sovereign people. The establishment of a Quilombo was an act of profound, architectural defiance against the entire economic and philosophical foundation of the New World. It was a glaring, intolerable contradiction to the European narrative of racial supremacy, a complex, thriving, highly organized society built entirely by those who had been legally classified as subhuman beasts of burden. High in the impenetrable mountains, hidden behind treacherous ravines and thick walls of thorny vegetation, the escaped warriors did not merely survive, they constructed a magnificent functioning kingdom. The fragmented tribes, differing languages, and distinct cultural lineages that had been violently thrown together in the suffocating bellies of the slave ships were now intentionally, beautifully synthesized into a unified, formidable nation. They established sophisticated councils of elders to govern with ancient wisdom. They planted vast, sustainable crops utilizing indigenous agricultural techniques learned from native allies, and they forged their own iron, turning the broken chains of their past into lethal, gleaming arrowheads and razor-sharp spears. The Quilombo became a legendary beacon, a whispered myth of absolute freedom that drifted down into the suffocating valleys of the plantations, inspiring terrifying hope in the hearts of those still enslaved and cold, paralyzing dread in the souls of the slave masters. The colonizers recognized with absolute clarity that the very existence of these independent, fortified settlements was a catastrophic threat to the colonial enterprise. If a slave could look up toward the mist-shrouded peaks and know that a kingdom of free black men existed, the psychological control of the plantation would inevitably crumble. Consequently, the empire unleashed a relentless, heavily funded series of military expeditions designed to entirely eradicate these sanctuaries from the face of the earth. Armies comprised of seasoned European mercenaries, local militiamen, and ruthless native trackers were dispatched into the jungle, dragging heavy artillery, muskets, and the burning arrogance of the imperial crown. They marched in rigid, colorful formations, their brass buttons gleaming in the sparse sunlight that pierced the canopy, utterly convinced that their superior firepower and formal military doctrines would swiftly crush what they perceived to be a disorganized band of starving, desperate fugitives. However, the military tacticians of the empire failed entirely to comprehend the terrifying evolution of the enemy they were marching against. The warriors of the Quilombo were no longer fighting within the cramped, surveilled confines of a dusty courtyard. They were defending their homes, their families, and their fiercely won sovereignty on a battlefield they knew intimately and controlled completely. The disguised martial art, the fluid, deceptive dance of death that had been their secret salvation, now evolved into an open, highly sophisticated system of guerrilla warfare. When the imperial columns marched into the narrow, suffocating gorges leading to the mountain fortresses, they found themselves completely engulfed in a psychological and physical nightmare. The jungle itself seemed to come violently alive. The warriors did not arrange themselves in static lines to be slaughtered by musket fire. They utilized the profound, deceptive mobility of their training, dropping silently from the high canopy like lethal shadows, striking with devastating, targeted precision, and vanishing back into the thick undergrowth before the European soldiers could even raise their heavy weapons or orient themselves in the chaos. The dense forest echoed with the terrifying, rhythmic beats of the war drums and the sharp, metallic commands of the Beremba, which was now openly utilized as an instrument of tactical military communication. The music dictated the flow of the ambush, coordinating simultaneous strikes from multiple unseen angles. The European soldiers, weighed down by heavy armor and entirely disoriented by the heat, the insects, and the sheer, unbroken walls of green, were systematically dismantled by an enemy that moved like water and struck like lightning. The sweeping, acrobatic kicks designed to evade a whip were now employed to knock heavily armed men from their horses and shattered the wooden stocks of their rifles. The colonizers found themselves trapped in a terrifying, asymmetrical war against phantoms who possessed the agility of panthers and the tactical brilliance of seasoned generals. Expedition after expedition was violently repelled, leaving behind trails of abandoned cannons, shattered egos, and the blood of empires soaking into the sovereign, unyielding earth of the Quilombo. The kingdom of the unyielding stood absolute, a magnificent, impregnable fortress forged from the very agony of slavery, proving to the world that the human spirit, when fueled by the rhythm of freedom, is a force that no chain, no whip, and no imperial army can ever hope to conquer. The relentless, grinding machinery of empire possesses an agonizing, inexhaustible patience, fueled by an insatiable hunger for absolute dominion. The colonizers, humiliated by decades of devastating defeats at the hands of the liberated warriors, eventually realized that a localized, tactical war against the Quilombos could not be won through conventional means. Therefore, the colonial powers shifted their strategy, bringing the full catastrophic weight of their global economic and military might to bear upon the isolated mountain fortresses. They funded massive, continental mercenary armies, dragged heavy, devastating siege artillery up the treacherous jungle paths, and initiated brutal, protracted campaigns of systematic starvation and attrition. The majestic wooden palisades of the free kingdoms, which had withstood the relentless assaults of infantry and cavalry for generations, were eventually splintered and reduced to ash by the indiscriminate, deafening roar of European cannons. The earth of the high plateaus, once a sacred sanctuary of liberty, was once again saturated with the blood of its fierce defenders. The empire declared a total, crushing victory, parading the severed heads of the fallen rebel leaders through the cobblestone streets of the coastal cities as a horrific, visceral warning to anyone who dared to dream of sovereignty. The colonial governors drafted triumphant letters to their distant monarchs, thoroughly convinced that the formidable, the terrifying specter of the warrior slave had been permanently eradicated from the New World. However, the arrogance of the conqueror consistently blinds him to the fundamental nature of the conquered. The empire fundamentally misunderstood the profound difference between the destruction of a physical location and the annihilation of a cultural ideology. When the walls of the great Quilombos finally fell beneath the overwhelming barrage of artillery, the kingdom of the unyielding was not extinguished. It was merely fractured into 1,000 indestructible shards, scattered violently across the sprawling, developing landscape of the continent. The surviving warriors, carrying the profound grief of their fallen comrades and the burning, undiminished embers of their ancestral pride, did not surrender. They seamlessly melted back into the shadows from whence they came, migrating down from the smoking mountains and filtering into the dark, labyrinthine alleys of the rapidly expanding port cities and the sprawling, impoverished urban fringes. They became dockworkers, street vendors, and laborers, outwardly reintegrating into the heavily policed, racialized hierarchy of the colonial economy. Yet, beneath their tattered clothing, the lethal muscle memory of the disguised martial art remained perfectly intact. The strategy of the diaspora underwent a necessary, brilliant evolution, The open militaristic warfare of the jungle fortress transitioned back into a sophisticated subterranean mechanism of cultural preservation. The sacred circle of the Rhoda was no longer convened in the sunlit clearings of a liberated mountain kingdom, but in the dimly lit, clandestine corners of the urban slums, hidden from the paranoid, roaming patrols of the city guards. Here, amidst the crushing poverty and the suffocating discrimination of the post-abolition era, the martial art assumed an entirely new, profound dimension. It ceased to be merely a physical weapon of lethal retaliation and transformed into an indestructible, living archive of their historical trauma and their extraordinary triumph. The elders, bearing the physical scars of the jungle wars and the emotional weight of a century of struggle, took the hands of the lost, disenfranchised youth of the favelas and pulled them into the rhythm. They taught them the agonizingly slow, deceptive movements of the ginga, whispering the ancient tales of the warrior kings and the bloody rebellions as they moved. The bloodline of resistance was no longer being transmitted through the inheritance of physical territory, but through the unbroken rhythmic pedagogy of the body. The oppressor had successfully burned the fortress, but in doing so, they had unwittingly released the spores of an invincible culture to the four winds, ensuring that the lethal, beautiful dance of the exiled warriors would permanently embed itself into the very genetic code of the developing nation. Time is the ultimate, uncompromising crucible, the great historical judge that inevitably reduces the majestic stone fortresses of mighty empires to scattered dust, while miraculously preserving the intangible, indestructible fragments of the human spirit. Centuries have drifted past since the agonizing era of the transatlantic slave trade, and the heavy, iron chains that once bound the wrists of the exiled warriors have long since rusted away into the unforgiving earth. The sprawling sugarcane plantations, the scenes of unspeakable agony and the sites of the first, bloody eruptions of vengeance, have been paved over by the relentless march of modernity. Yet, if one listens closely, beneath the deafening, metallic roar of the contemporary world, the solitary, metallic twang of the berimbau continues to echo with an astonishing, unbroken clarity. The magnificent deception, the lethal martial art disguised as a tribal dance, did not fade into the obscure footnotes of forgotten history. Instead, it stepped proudly and defiantly out of the blood-soaked shadows and ascended onto the global stage, recognized today as one of the most profound, physically demanding, and spiritually rich cultural phenomena on the planet. The art of captors, what began as a desperate, ingenious mechanism for survival in the suffocating darkness of a ship's hold, has blossomed into an immortal, transnational legacy of liberation. The sacred circle of the Rhoda is no longer a hidden, fearful gathering of condemned men anticipating the crack of a whip. It is now formed in the bustling public squares of modern metropolises, in the highly disciplined academies of martial artists, and on the sun-drenched beaches of a world entirely transformed. People of all races, languages, and origins now step into the center of that circle, bowing with profound reverence to the instruments and moving their bodies to the exact same hypnotic rhythms that once orchestrated the bloody downfall of plantation masters. When a modern practitioner drops to the ground to execute a sweeping acrobatic kick, they are not merely performing a display of physical agility, they are engaging in a visceral kinetic dialogue with the ghosts of the past. They are channeling the terrifying, coiled energy of the men and women who utilized those exact same movements to shatter the absolute authority of the colonial empire. The immortal legacy of the Black Warriors is a testament to the supreme, unconquerable power of human resilience. It teaches us a philosophical truth that transcends the boundaries of time and geography, that true freedom cannot be entirely granted by an emancipation proclamation, nor can it be permanently extinguished by the imposition of a shackle. Freedom is an internal, fiercely guarded territory, a rhythm that must be constantly maintained. Even when the surrounding world is consumed by deafening silence and insurmountable darkness, the story of these exiled fighters is a monumental beacon of hope, proving that out of the deepest, most horrifying abysses of human cruelty, humanity possesses the miraculous capacity to forge a profound, breathtaking beauty. The music of the berimbau did not just dictate a rebellion, it composed an eternal anthem for the oppressed. The bloody dance of the ancestors has metamorphosed into a vibrant, perpetual celebration of life, ensuring that the memory of their suffering, their genius, and their ultimate, terrifying triumph will never ever be erased. The warriors may have long since returned to the earth, but their rhythm remains immortal, and their dance will never, truly, stop.